Hello and welcome to another video. So today I thought I would do another play review, and so I was thinking about what could I talk about, and I thought a play that I haven't seen for a very long time might be quite good, and also a play that the first time I ever read it I didn't enjoy. So I thought today we would talk about Blood Brothers by Willie Russell. Now, if you don't know what Blood Brothers is about, I will give you a brief summary when I'm talking about it. But mainly, of course, it is known as a musical. Now, it is a story about two twins. One was kept by their mother and the other one was given away. It's all about how they grew up. They were born on the very same day. They grew up in very, very different circumstances, and they both die on the very same day in the same circumstances. It's one of those plays where it's very interesting to see, and it also the playwright Russell tried to mirror what was going on with the working classes and the lower classes of British society during the periods that this play is set on. So, the characters that we first meet are Mrs. Johnston, the mother of these two twins. When we meet her, she has just discovered that she's pregnant again. She has 6 other children at this point as well. Her husband has just ran off and left her for a younger model, and she goes off and finds herself a part-time cleaning job for a very rich couple who live on the other side of the park. In this city, we can very much see the differences class-wise of these characters by which side of the park they live on. Once we find this out, we also discover that the woman that she works for, Mrs. Lyons, cannot have children. The reason her and her husband have bought such a lavish, such a big house was purely down to the fact that they were under the illusion they would have children. Obviously, since their marriage up to that point, they had not. So, when the discovery has been found of that Mrs. Johnston is going to have twins, and that she does not feel that she can manage having twins, the plan starts taking effect in Mrs. Lyon's brain by saying, we could almost pretend I'm pregnant as well. Then when the babies are born, you give me one of them. So, with her husband away, she begins an elaborate plan throughout Mrs. Johnston's pregnancy. And during this time, obviously, she's writing letters to her family, her husband, her friends, expressing how wonderful it is that she is pregnant, so everyone knows that she's expecting this child. Of course, when the babies are finally given birth to, they are separated, and Mrs. Johnston, of course, carries on cleaning for the Lyonses. But it's up to about 5 or 6 months after the birth, Mrs. Lyons decides that she thinks that Mrs. Johnston isn't doing her job. She's spending a lot of time cooing over the child that she gave up. It's around this point that we discover what these two women have called their sons. Mrs. Johnson has called the son that she kept Mickey, and Mrs. Lyons has decided to call her son Edward. So at this point, of course, Mr. Lyons has returned home, and he doesn't quite agree with his wife's decision to sack Mrs. Johnston. So he tries to lessen the upset for Mrs. Johnston. So a few years pass, and Mrs. Johnston has got herself another job. She's getting a bit of money in. She's doing okay. She still isn't exactly running a wonderful way with a lot of money, but she's able to survive and make sure all of her children have food. And one day, Mickey and a friend, Linda, are in the park playing a game, and Michael and Edward decides to go and join these two children playing, because he's like, oh, I've never seen these two people before, let's go and have a play with them. And this is the first time they meet, and Mickey is very lively, he's got a great imagination. He can play anything. All he really would love to do would be a cowboy, or you know, be in the Wild West. He always has a game. He always has a plan. He always has fun. Linda is very much the same. Edward, on the other hand, is not. He has everything that he would ever want. He has the best toys. He has all the mod cons of that time. He of course has imagination, of course, but because of all the things that he does have, he also struggles to have friendships with people, because of the fact that his mother is so protective of him. So after a few minutes of play, they finally become firm friends, and Mickey decides that the best way to cement their friendship forever is to do that old thing that many hundreds of people have done throughout the centuries, which is blood brothers, which would be, of course, pricking your fingers and putting your blood together. Of course, not knowing that they are truly related anyway, but this is what they do. Then they carry on playing, now knowing that they are firm friends and they'll be friends forever. Then, of course, later on, they get in trouble by the police, and Edward, not knowing what to do, he freezes, he gets scared, he's almost willing to completely confess to everything that they've done, knocking on people's doors, running away, stealing from shops. All of that is, terrible. But of course, Mickey and Linda, this is where you see the different sides of the tracks, per se. You see that Mickey tells him, tells Edward, oh, be cool, do this, and, it will be fine. Later on, you see that both boys are taken home, and the way the police officers talk to their mothers, you can see very interestingly. You can see that Mickey and his other siblings have always been in trouble with the police. You can tell that it's almost a weekly occurrence at the Johnston household, and it's the way it's done. A clip around the ear and all of that. It's just what happens with that family. The police officer to Mrs. Lyons is very polite, just saying, make sure that young Edward here doesn't go back onto the other side of the park and doesn't recreate this sort of friendship again with these less than ideal people. And once this happens, Mrs. Lyons is terrified that now that he's met Mickey, that this friendship will carry on, and she's terrified, like I say, and she basically bombards her husband by saying, this house, we can't live here anymore, this house is wrong, it's all this, any excuse you can possibly think of moving. And that's what they do. They finally do. They move out. They leave the city and they go out into the countryside. And strangely enough, actually, it's that whole idea of it, and it's quite a terrifying sort of idea for this young lad, Edward, who's just made a very firm friend. Who promised to be friends forever with, and his mother and his father obviously are making him break that promise. But of course, having to do it anyway. Then, of course, once he leaves, you discover that Mickey just carries on living a life of going to the local schools, getting into trouble nearly every week, and then, just doing what, things like that. Edward, on the other hand, goes off and has a very privileged lifestyle. He goes to the best schools in the county, he goes to the best universities, gets the best education. Now that they've grown up, you see that Mickey and Linda are together, and that and he's got himself into petty crime with an elder brother of his, and he goes into prison and all that sort of thing. And he comes out a much harder, much darker individual, which, like I said earlier on, mirrors what was happening in Britain when this play was meant to be based, which is, I think, around the 70s and the 80s. I'm not sure about that. So, with that in mind, when Edward actually comes back into the story, and all three of them meet up again, Mickey, Linda, and Edward, you discover that how things have really, changed these three people. They got Mickey and Linda got married. They've got a child, and it's quite desperate for them, I feel. And Edward actually does something very remarkably quite strange here. He knows the path that Mickey's going down is a dangerous path, and he tries to go to his mother, Mrs. Johnston, not really realising that she's his mother as well. But and she gives him a heart-to-heart, saying, this is his choice. I don't want him to do any of this. He hasn't had a good life, he hasn't had a privileged life like you have. And it's, and through that, then you discover that after that, they have this meeting, and Mickey comes home, and his mother, his mother actually tells him, look, I've never told you this before, you had a twin who I always said died in childbirth. That's complete rubbish. Your twin brother is Edward Lyons. With that, he goes completely berserk. He goes off and he goes and asks his brother, where's that gun you used for your last job? Where have you hidden it? I need it. And he goes to the town hall, or the city hall, or Edward's office, or somewhere, I can't remember. And he shoots him in the middle of this meeting, and the police are called, and they have to try, they shoot Mickey, which of course is terrible, because obviously that means, they're obviously these two people born on the same day by the same mother, and died on the very same day in very similar circumstances. So yes, like I said earlier on, it's a musical. So there's a number of songs in this play. There a lot of them are obviously done by the characters just to try and get across in a more interesting way, I feel, than just an ordinary monologue. They give you points of view from the characters, but obviously when the narrator does the singing, obviously that gives you a lot more interesting idea of what these characters have gone through, and in a wider context. So with that, we have to talk about the individual characters. Like I said, Mrs. Johnston is struggling all the way through this play with all of her children, her money worries, all of those issues that any mother with a large amount of children has to worry about. Mrs. Lyons, of course, has very different worries to Mrs. Johnston. She has to worry about the lives of herself, her husband, and her one and only child. She, from the moment that Edward was given to her, she considered him her own. She spent 8 months pretending that she was pregnant, so to her, he actually feels as if it is her child. So that is like that. Mickey, of course, has everywhere that Eddie had a successful career or successful life or education, he had the almost polar opposite. He had nothing like that. Same really with Linda. Linda had Linda had a choice. It's not exactly made an important part in the play, but when they were children and they first meet, it is clear that she likes Edward, and she is, she thinks he's a nice boy. And over the years, of course, she keeps on thinking of Edward, but of course she ends up with Mickey. She gets married to Mickey, she has Mickey's child. But it's very near the end, before the conversation that Mickey had with his mother, you hear that Linda says to Edward that she liked him. It's just so that way there. So if it had been the other way around, I'm sure it'd have been a very interesting story as well. In either way, these three characters' lives are very dangerously put across by this one fateful decision that Mrs. Lyons and Mrs. Johnston made that day in the kitchen. So yes, it's just a very good play. It's a wonderful story. It's a story of how a family can be torn apart, even though they don't know that they are family. A family can be torn apart very easily by a decision. Thank you very much for watching, and I'm sure I'll see you next week.